Greetings everyone, welcome to another episode of Our Shakespeare, where I talk about Shakespeare from a 21st century American perspective. Today, I'd like to talk about Titus Andronicus. Specifically, I'd like to talk about the subject of a culture of violence in Titus Andronicus. And before we get any further, I do want to make it clear that I am not going to be summarizing the play Titus Andronicus in this video. If you're interested in a summary of the play and some general thoughts about the play, check out my episode of Shakespeare, and I'll put a link in the comments for that video below if you're interested in checking that out before you watch this one. But today, I'd like to focus on violence. I want to look at violence in a couple of different ways. And before I get into the specific ways, I would like to say that I'm not just talking about violence in terms of stabby, people maiming each other, harming each other in physical ways, although that is part of it. I'm talking about violence in a very general way. I'm talking about anything that does any kind of harm to a person or a group of people. That can be physical harm, emotional harm, etc. So I'm looking at violence very, very generally. Now, I am looking at four categories of violence. I'm looking at physical violence, yes. I'm looking at political violence. I am looking at sexual violence, and I'm looking at racial violence. And I want to talk about how these four different types of violence figure heavily into this play, and how the society presented in this play is a violent society in these ways, and how that informs the actions of some of the characters, and how that may inform how we are to react to the end of the play. So, first, I want to set up the idea that Rome, the city in the play, the society that is presented in the play, is a violent place from the beginning. So I want to go from the very beginning. We have Titus Andronicus returning home from war with the Goths. This is a nation at war. This is a nation steeped in the violence of war. Now, some societies, when they're in the midst of war or they're in the midst of violence, are not happy with it. They do not want the violence. But in this play, we have some evidence that the city was in support of the violence to a certain extent, because the people's choice for emperor at the beginning of the play is Titus himself. The venerable general returning from war is the man that they wanted to lead them into the future with the death of their previous emperor. And so in that regard, we see that the people approve of war as shown through their approval of Titus Andronicus, the general. So that's point number one. Point number two, this society is a sexually violent society, as evidenced by events in the play, and will continue to be a sexually violent society after the events of the play are over. And what I mean by that, or at least what evidence I have for that, is in the characters of Tamara and Lavinia, who are our two female characters in the play. And what I want to point to is how neither of these characters have a whole lot of agency in the play at any point. Now, you could be saying, whoa, hold on there. Tamara has tons of agency. She is wielding her agency and seeking revenge against Titus the entire play. However, I want to refute that idea, because I want to point out that at every point in the play, Tamara only has as much power as the men in her life will allow her to have. For example, at the beginning of the play, she is a prisoner to Titus Andronicus. She can do nothing about the fact that Titus is sacrificing her son at the beginning of the play. She has no power in that situation. The only way she has any power at all in the play is when she becomes attached to Saturninus. And the power that she has is given to her by her relationship to the man Saturninus. Not only that, every act that she does of revenge basically comes down to the men in her life doing it. She, as a person, does very little. She is very reliant on the men in her life being willing to do the things that she hopes that they will do. She herself has little agency to do things on her own. Then also we see with Lavinia, and we see especially with how she's treated midway through the play, but even at the beginning of the play, we see that Lavinia is defined as a character by her choice to marry Bassanus rather than Saturninus. I'm sorry, Bassianus rather than Saturninus. She is defined by her choice of man. And also, when she makes that choice, the men in her life, her brothers, feel the need to protect her from her father. And so we see that this is a society where the women are powerless in comparison to men, and how they rely on the men in their life to be able to do things for them. And so that is a form of sexual violence towards women in general. Next, I want to get to racial violence. We see through the way Aaron is spoken of and treated by the people around him in this play that Aaron as a Moor is not accepted as a person in the same way that other people are accepted. And this is a society that automatically views Aaron as evil because of his Moorishness. So those are ways that the play sets up the fact that this is a violent society from the very beginning, and would be a violent society no matter what happens in the actions of these particular characters in this particular plot. So, into that world, we go into the specific acts of violence that take place in the plot. And the whole play begins with an act of political violence. And I want to start by talking about political violence. The play opens with basically the election, the jockeying for the position of emperor by Saturninus and Bassianus, the two brothers. And the very beginning of the play actually finds neither of them as the choice of the people. The choice of the people for the position of emperor is Titus Andronicus, but he doesn't want it. And so we actually start the play with an act of political violence towards the people of Rome. And that political violence comes in the form of their preferred candidate refusing to take the position, and them ending up getting stuck with a leader, an emperor, that the people don't really want so much. And I find that to be very reminiscent of what we often have in America today. For the last several decades, as long as I've been of voting age, the phrase voting for the lesser of two evils is something that has come up for the past several elections, and how we never seem to be electing somebody who is actually the preferred choice of the people. And that is a form of political violence that begins the play with the people's choice not coming to fruition. But beyond that, there is political violence that takes place between Saturninus and Bassianus. That family is divided by Saturninus being selected as emperor and Bassianus not being selected as emperor. That family is divided. It ends up in Bassianus getting killed, the ultimate division of their family. But also Titus Andronicus' family becomes divided through this political violence in the form of Titus, at the beginning of the play, having loyalty for Saturninus, and his daughter Lavinia having loyalty for Bassianus, which leads to Titus killing his own son out of disloyalty for Saturninus for standing up for Lavinia's choice of Bassianus. So this political violence has led to family violence, to family divisions in multiple families in the play. Not only that, but the political violence continues throughout the play with the government as represented by Saturninus and Tamara and her sons and Aaron doing various forms of violence against Titus and his family. And so the whole setup of the play and the revenge story hinges on this act of political violence at the very beginning with this election. And then I want to move into physical violence, and obviously this is a very physically violent play. It's probably the first thing people think about when they think about Titus Andronicus is how violent it is, how many characters get killed, and how physical violence defines the back and forth revenge plot. Titus himself, if we just stick with Titus, he kills Tamara's oldest son. He kills his own son. He kills Tamara's two other sons. He kills Tamara herself. Also, Titus gets his hand chopped off by Aaron. Titus's sons get killed by the emperor when they are framed for the murder of Bassianus. And Titus himself gets killed by Saturninus, and Titus's daughter Lavinia gets mutilated by Chiron and Demetrius. That is just the violence relating to this one character of Titus Andronicus, and it's a lot of violence in this play. And it should not be surprising to any of us that violence is what these people resort to, because that is the society in which they find themselves, where war is uplifted and celebrated. It's not surprising that people resort to violent revenge to right their perceived wrongs. It's also interesting, and I think probably the most important, at least to me, sequences in the play that I kind of latch onto as philosophically interesting is the scene where Titus is begging help from people, and they are passing him by and refusing him, so he begins to speak to the stones and share his lamentations with the stones along the road. And his brother asks him what he's doing, and he says basically, well, the people will not listen. I have no recourse but to share my lamentations with the stones. And then later he decides he has the recourse of physical violence because that's what he knows as the celebrated general. And so it should not be surprising that this violence takes place in this place because of how society is. And next we have sexual violence, and this is another one of those elements that people think of when they think of this play, is how Lavinia is treated. And Lavinia is raped by Chiron and Demetrius before she is mutilated and her tongue cut out, her hands cut off. It should not be surprising to any of us that acts this heinous would take place in a society that does not give voice to women. Lavinia doesn't have a voice really from the beginning of the play. She only has agency to the extent that the men in her life can do something for her, or that she can latch on to a man. That's established in the first scene of the play. It's not surprising that a society that views women this way would find people like Chiron and Demetrius doing these horrible things. Now I want to make it very clear, I do not think that we can excuse Chiron and Demetrius for their actions just because they're operating in a society that treats women the way that it does and doesn't give them the same agency that it gives to men. What Chiron and Demetrius do are evil, and the blame is theirs. However, society is also evil in this case. I also find it striking as a visual image of Lavinia having no tongue and no hands, rendered unable to communicate after this rape because she is a voiceless character. Now, what I find striking also in this example of sexual violence is how when she is finally able to reveal who her attackers were by writing their names in the sand with a stick held in her mouth, she is relying on the men in her life to do something about it. Titus ends up getting his revenge on Chiron and Demetrius for it. However, if I was to do a little bit of a thought experiment and imagine how things would have been different if she still had her tongue and she still had her hands, I suspect the play would go similarly. She would just reveal it was Chiron and Demetrius sooner, and Titus would get his revenge sooner. That she would still be forced to rely on the man in her life to do something about it. And so she is voiceless both literally and figuratively in that way. And finally, to get back to the idea of the racial violence that I talked about at the beginning of the play, with Aaron the Moor viewed as an evil character simply because he's a Moor, I find it quite striking the ways in which Aaron as a character seems to have internalized this idea that he is a villain. He seems to revel in it, he seems to celebrate it, but he also seems to acknowledge through the way that he speaks and through the language that he uses that he is this evil black man, that he's not just an evil man, that he is an evil black man. And some of the language choices that he has point to that idea. And then, and here is where I think the play becomes super uncomfortable for me as a 21st century American, right now speaking from the year 2018, how the play ends as it relates to racial violence. The play ends with the government executing the black man and blaming the black man for all of the evil that has happened over the course of the play. Aaron is literally referred to as the breeder of these dire events at the end of the play when he is brought to Lucius for sentencing. And the way that he is executed is really nasty. He's buried up to his neck and starved to death. It's a slow, painful death that he is about to endure. And the play ends with the execution of a black man, the one black man in the play who is blamed as the breeder of these dire events. Not Tamara, not Saturninus, not Titus, who actually is the first person to commit a murder in the play when he kills Tamara's sons, but the underprivileged Moor is executed at the end of the play. And that, to me, speaks volumes about how this play relates to today. Now, at the end of the play, we are presented with a choice on how to take what's happened. You can view the ending of the play cynically, or you can view the ending of the play hopefully. And the play basically ends with the seed of Titus, Lucius, as emperor, and the seed of Tamara and Aaron, in the form of that baby that they had together, being raised by Lucius. Now you have a choice as an audience. Are you going to take this hopefully, and the possibility that that might bring peace, that Lucius will raise this child bringing peace between these two vengeful factions? Or do you view it cynically, that the seed of Titus and the seed of Aaron and Tamara remain in society and the cycle of vengeance will continue? Now, I right now at this moment in my life am viewing it cynically because, as I said at the beginning, this is a violent society. It is a society that celebrates the violence of war. It is a society that views racial differences poorly and negatively. It is a society that does not give women the same agency that it gives men. And in that society, unless all of society manages to change, I do not see this getting better. Now, my problem with this play, first of all, I do find this play entertaining, and that's part of the problem. I don't think Shakespeare presents all of these themes of, violence begetting violence, and this idea that revenge is basically mutually assured destruction. I do not believe that Shakespeare presents these ideas in a thematic way with the intention of showing that violence is bad. To me, he presents it as entertainment. And I find that troubling. But you might view it differently, and I'd love to hear what you think in the comments below. If you like what I'm doing, please remember to like and subscribe. Fare you well. I commend you to your own content.